Hello. So let me start the last session. Welcome everyone to the last session of the forum. I am Asami Miketa. I'm a senior program officer of International Renewable Energy Agency. This session will discuss the risk and systemic innovation in long-term energy policy planning. And when we designed this session, we wanted to design it in a way to wrap up the discussion that we had throughout the day. So just to go back to where we started, in the opening session, Dove spoke about the motivation why IRENA is addressing this issue of long-term energy scenarios for clean energy transition, and how to develop and use scenarios for policy-making relevant way is a classic topic, but here we wanted to discuss that with this drastic transition to clean energy system, we are asking ourselves whether current scenario practice, both in terms of modeling and methodology and the process of producing scenarios, and also use of scenarios, this may change. And in particular, during the LTES activities over the last 2 years, many member governments expressed interest in learning how other countries are addressing, how to address these big uncertainties around key technology and social innovations, and how to address the risk of making wrong policy decisions. So in this session, we would like to hear from the speakers how the long-term energy scenario should improve to capture risks and systemic innovations to inform policy making in government. So we have 3 speakers today sharing respective perspectives from national government, interregional government, and intergovernmental processes. So I would like to first introduce Mr. Giovani Machado. He's a Director of Energy Economics and Environmental Studies, representing Energy Research Office of the Brazilian government. So Giovani, you have floor for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Asami. Hello, everyone. I hope all of you are healthy and safe, including the audience. It's a difficult time. So first, I would like to thank IRENA for inviting EPE to have this talk in the second International Forum Long-Term Energy Scenario for Clean Energy Transition. IRENA has been an important partner to EPE, collaborating on several issues related to long-term energy scenarios. I also take this opportunity to say hi to my colleagues in the panel. So hi. Can you please move the screen? Or thank you. So first, some brief words about EPE. EPE is states for Energy Research Office. It's a governmental body associated to the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Brazil. Basically, EPE develops studies and researches to assist the ministry to elaborate the energy planning of Brazil. The easiest way to understand the role of EPE is to think about the Energy Information Administration in the US and its relations with the DOE, the Department of Energy in the US. So we carry out activities related to energy statistics, national energy plans, both for 10 years horizon and for 2050 long term. And also we provide support and contributions to energy policy discussions and formulations. Actually, we like to see ourselves as an institution that promotes the reduction of asymmetry of information, the transaction costs to decision takers in the government, market, and society, and also that contributes to removing barriers to new entrants in the market. Finally, we believe that open data create value to the economy and to the society. As you can see in the screen, in the slide, EPE linked all the steps of energy planning, include long term. So that's the way we handle all the challenges of energy scenarios and energy planning. Can you move, please? Okay, thank you. So, as I said before, EPE deals with the whole cycle of energy planning, and this includes long-term energy scenarios. As we all know, to elaborate long-term energy scenarios is a complex activity involving both economic, technological, and environmental perspectives, and a lot of uncertainties and risks. So it's important to support energy. It's important. So long-term energy scenarios is important to support energy planning, to elaborate national energy plans, and to design energy policy and market reforms and regulations. So long-term energy scenarios is particularly important, relevant to Brazil, as we face what we call a paradox of abundance, because we are plenty of several different energy sources. So we have oil and gas, we have biomass, hydro, nuclear, wind, solar, residuals, and so on. In this sense, we make choices. We have to make choices under uncertainties and risks of changes in demand and supply, in infrastructure requirements, in price of different energy sources, and so on. Please, can you move? So, because Brazil is plenty of energy resources and technological alternatives, both indigenous and foreigners, it's fundamental to establish an open, more competitive, and diversified market. That's because it's important to avoid technological lock-in and to design and promote competitive markets. This is fundamental to deal with uncertainties, particularly in our time, with those related to climate change and energy transition. There's a lot of things going on, so it's very important to establish a very flexible and competitive marketplace. So under which circumstance will Brazil have more hydro or more nuclear, more gas or more new renewables such as wind and solar? What about electromobility and energy storage? What about biomass? How fast will digitalization and energy efficiency penetrate in the market? How long will oil and gas market stand? What about price, cost, preference, consumers? And finally, we are facing this black swan right now. So will the new coronavirus change preference and world in the long term? It's a question we cannot answer right now, but after the crisis, it will be important to see if this will change the way people do business and activities. If particularly if this will accelerate digitalization and home office and things like that, new technologies. Can you move, please? Thank you. So that's why we need long-term energy scenarios to answer, or at least try to answer, those questions. To conclude, I want to point out that there are remaining gaps and challenges to be overcome. With the collaboration of IRENA and the LTES campaign, we have to face all those, we have been facing all those challenges in Brazil. So the energy transition will bring additional challenges, and I will list them. Data collection and modeling and analysis with more granularity. For instance, daily and intraday data and modeling, for instance. Demand forecast with large share of distributed energy resources because of the figure of the prosumer. This will bring a lot of uncertainties and will require flexibility of the market, a new approach to energy planning. Digitalization and also cybersecurity is very important to bear in mind that in a more connected and digitalization circumstance and world, cybersecurity will be very important to energy planning. We have to elaborate crisis plan, contingency plans, to know how to avoid a massive cyber attacks and to protect the system as a whole. Capacity building of bottom-up energy modeling, big data, digitalization, and so on. Impact assessment of higher share of non-dispatchable sources and implication. Finally, stakeholders engagement and communication. So can you move? It's the last one. Just to thank you all so much for the time and attention, and that's all I have to say today.
Thank you very much, Giovani. So thank you also for commenting that we have been working closely between IRENA and the Brazilian Energy Planning Office. The Brazilian Energy Planning Office has very strong modeling capacity, and they have been developing scenarios to support the government decision, the government planning process. So now I would like to move to the next speaker, Dr. Ruud Kempener. He's a policy officer at Directorate-General for Energy of the European Commission. So I understand that he's more in the position of building the scenarios rather than developing the scenarios. But yeah, floor is yours, Ruud. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Asami, and also welcome to the other panelists and the audiences on the this forum. And also good to see that everyone has a new office nowadays. What I wanted to do in my talk today is indeed kind of mention these two elements which we want to talk about now, which is risk and system innovation and long-term energy planning. Let's start with the beginning, and I think that energy modeling in general and long-term energy planning are key for policymaking in the European Commission. We have an obligation that whenever we put out new proposals, policy proposals, that we have to assess the social, economic, environmental impacts of those policy proposals. And modeling plays a key role in there. And so that's where kind of trying to mitigate any risks associated with these different possible impacts are being done, and modeling plays an important role in that. And that's also where kind of modeling, especially in the last couple of years when we were preparing a new legislative framework for renewable energy policy, played a crucial role. Our horizon, our policy horizon for the new Renewable Energy Directive, which was adopted in 2018 and which member states are now implementing, is from 2021 to 2030, and that means knowing that renewable is a very dynamic market, modeling played a crucial role in trying to understand what are the impacts of these different policy options which we put forward and their implications for society, for the economy, and for also the energy security of our system. Besides playing a crucial role in assessing the impacts of our policy proposals, of course, long-term energy strategies and modeling is key to develop our long-term energy strategies. What's on your slide now is work which we did at the end of 2018 to help the European Commission and the EU member states to come up with a new proposal on what our objective should be for 2050. This work in 2018 actually builds on work which already happened in 2011, where the European Commission did its first set of scenarios for 2050. And I wanted to flag this particular slide because I think it shows an interesting insight in the role of system innovation, especially in our modeling activities. So the 2011 scenarios which we did to look to 2050 had a number of sub-scenarios in there, and all of these scenarios actually looked at technologies. So there was one scenario which looked at renewable energy technology, there was one scenario which looked at CCS, there was one scenario which looked at nuclear. Sorry. Fast forwarding 7 years in 2018, this graph shows the different scenarios which we did now 2 years ago. What I highlighted there are in red and green are the two end targets which we used in our scenario. So first we did a whole set of scenarios which looked at how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% compared to 2005. And then we did a number of scenarios where we looked at how can we come to a climate neutral economy by 2050. I think the interesting part to show here is that the scenarios which we did in 2018 don't necessarily look at energy supply options for each scenario. Instead, they are much more what we call kind of system innovation scenarios. So we looked at, okay, what are the different potential pathways to get from a situation where we are today to a decarbonized energy system, looking at the different pathways possible. So as you can see, pathways included as much as possible the use of electrification, a pathway which really primarily focused on hydrogen, a pathway which used electricity to produce hydrogen and then decarbonize gases, which we then would be able to use in current gas infrastructures, for example. A scenario which primarily focused on energy efficiency, so on the demand side, and trying to reduce that as much as possible. And a scenario where we also coupled it to economic activities and looking at, okay, how can we reduce energy and make our energy use much more effective by reducing materials, providing energy services, and providing material efficiency. Each and one of those scenarios gave us different pathways with quite distinct different outputs in terms of costs, technology deployment, etc. And what we then did was to combine those those solutions which were the most cost effective in order to see how much further we could push decarbonization with the different combinations of options available throughout these different pathways. Now, the last two scenarios, which are here called the 1.5 tech and the 1.5 life, are building on these previous scenarios again. So like I said before, they're not only looking at different options for renewable energy, but also how can we get those decarbonized options towards our users. And then we developed two scenarios, one which really focused as a starting point the users. So how can we reduce energy demand and then try to supply through different energy carriers the decarbonized energy to our suppliers. And another one where we let energy demand grow alongside with, of course, economic development, and then try to push as much, produce as much as possible these decarbonized energy supply options and bring them to the end consumers. So looking at this, we really, in the Commission already, have seen a shift in the way we use these modelings, looking instead of individual options and what are the cost efficiency with that, towards the use of these models to really look at system innovation. How do the different kind of pathways compare to each other, and how can they be combined to create a kind of much more smarter and integrated energy system? Now, there was 7 years between the 2011 scenarios and the ones which you did in 2018. In the next slide, you see that with the dynamic developments in the European Union, we have to accelerate this process. So this is actually a call to many of the people who are here online as well, because last week what we published is what we call a new kind of inception report for the next impact assessment, which we're going to do this year. As some of you might know, last year the European Council members adopted climate neutrality as our objective for 2050. That means that we're also looking at how can we accelerate greenhouse gas emission reductions between now and 2030. That means we're going to do another modeling exercise to see what are the most cost-effective policy options to make this acceleration happen. This impact assessment, and I listed this below, looks at a number of elements. So again, we're looking at energy affordability, sustainability, and security of these different pathways, the type and the pace of clean energy technologies which will be needed to accelerate our scenarios, but also the macroeconomic, social, and environmental impacts of an acceleration of greenhouse gas emission reductions in up to 2030 towards this climate neutral objective in 2050. So this is actually a call to all of you, because we need people with experience in modeling to give us also feedback on how can we, through these impact assessments, reduce any risks associated with the acceleration of our targets in the next 10 years. The last part of our study, of my talk, I wanted to kind of use to look at the challenges ahead. And there I'm pleased to see that Giovani and I have more or less the same views, because in the next slide, I think one of the key aspects which is going to be critical for us and where we don't have a full grasp yet is how to model the already ongoing development in our energy system, especially in Europe, where we're moving from a centralized to a more decentralized system already, and eventually to a really distributed energy system which is fully digitalized. These developments are already happening today in Europe. We know that out of every second rooftop solar PV being installed in Germany has a battery connected with it. The latest figures just show the surge in the sales of electric vehicles, going from 3% in Europe to now 5%, and expected to go towards 10% in the next year. We see many European members, which are rapidly increasing the share of variable renewable energy, solar and heat into the energy system, and are using and coupling the electricity markets to localized heating systems to provide the necessary flexibility. Virtual power plants are already operating within the EU. We have companies which are providing aggregated demand response across buildings, businesses, and SMEs. And with our new legislation, we are actually encouraging and already increasing phenomena whereby energy communities can be established locally, but also virtually, where people can kind of produce, share, and consume their own electricity. Our models are not able to cope with these developments yet. At the same time, it might not this might not necessarily be the task of the modeling scenarios or the modeling tools which we're using today. Because, as I said, we're at the moment primarily looking at, okay, how can we achieve this 2050 most cost effectively? But then again, if we are moving towards policy instruments, we have to find ways to better understand not only what are the implications of our policies on affordability, security, and the costs of energy, but also how are they going to affect these new business models which are appearing increasingly across the European Union. So that's definitely an area where we are very much interested to understand what is happening in the field. How can we kind of work with others to get a better grasp on how these developments are going to shape and change our future energy system. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand over to the next panelists.
Thank you, Ruud. Thank you for pointing out that modeling and scenarios are key in the policy making for the European Commissions, and also pointing out that there are few challenges like decentralization and distributed system, how we can actually do the modeling of this. So we hope that we can touch upon these questions in the question and answer session. Now with that, I would like to go to the third presenter. She's Joana, Portugal, Pereira. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. She's a professor at the Energy Planning Program of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And she's also a lead author of one of the IPCC chapters. And she was also a senior scientist at the IPCC Working Group 3 on climate change mitigation. So we wanted to hear from her, based on her experience at the IPCC, where the scientific community stands in terms of addressing the risks and the innovation in the long-term energy systems. So, Joana, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Asami, for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me well. Yeah, Alexa. And thank you very much for the great effort organizers had to set up this webinar. I must admit I was very much disappointed when I saw it would be cancelled, and actually I feel very flattered we managed to transit to a digitalization, and perhaps in the future this will be another format and alternatives, and also implies reduced greenhouse gas emissions from flying and flying chain. So if we could move for my next slide, please. Firstly, I would like to introduce where I come from and what our research group and department does to support policymakers in developing short, mid, and long-term low-carbon scenarios, and how it's important both in the science and policymaking arenas. So I come from a lab, a research group in the energy planning department from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the largest and most influential technological and research centers in Latin America region. We have been helping policymakers and developing integrated assessment models since 2002. We have over 20 senior research working with us, and we are very proud to say we are the only global South integrated assessment model team. Why is that important? Because, as mentioned by previous speakers, it's essential to interact and evaluate specific context of the global south, developing transitions. And that's very important to have know-how from the global south perspective when we are talking in international arena and climate negotiations. So we have been helping regional governments, specifically the Brazilian government, in developing long-term strategies, for instance, to the Paris Agreement goals and development and energy security targets in the country. We work with energy and land use integrated assessment models, both at global scale and national scale. And that with soft and hard links, we have our own complete general equilibrium models that assess the economic impacts of certain energy transitions. Having said that, we also support some other researchers in other Latin American countries, and I would like to highlight our collaboration with Ecuador and Peru, for instance. Next slide, please. So, I have been working for the past 5 years between science and policy interfaces. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we have a typical plenary in IPCC with 195 countries and all the policymakers and climate negotiators. And on the right-hand side, we have hundreds of scientists developing assessment reports and assessing the available literature and synthesizing information and making available information which is policy relevant, but far from being policy prescriptive. And in between, if you can just move for the next, we have the IPCC working group. 3 working groups work on the physical science, impact, adaptation, and vulnerability of climate change, and the last one, work group 3, on mitigation of climate change, where I was involved for 2 years working together in developing the special reports that were just released in the last 2 years. So why are these things so challenging? If we could move to the next slide, please. Typically, scientists and policymakers, they operate and they think in different time scales. For instance, a typical policymaker thinks about being re-elected in the next 4 years' time, while we scientists, we optimize our models in long term for 2050 or even 2100. So there's a big gap in terms of goals. Another big difference I could highlight here is, for instance, when we work in modeling, what means a model is feasible? It means it's solved, usually for the least cost and foresight modeling. While for a policymaker, feasibility means what is socially accepted or institutionally possible. There's a big difference on that. So we scientists, we have priorities in publishing papers that only scientists read with very limited reach out. We work with methods that typically tend to be quantitative and are very accurate in terms of supply side modeling, but they may fail behind and overlook demand side. And when we talk with policymakers, they want to ensure we are including the sustainability dimensions of the problems, including economic growth, social development, among others. While our energy and land use models, they are very accurate and quantitative, but they miss somehow, and there's a gap in science we need to fill, how to better include risks, how to better include social innovation. Next slide, please. So, in my view, why do we need to bridge this gap? Why we need to merge perspectives between science and policymakers? Firstly, long-term scenarios are essential because they do tell us where we want to be in future, meaning that 2050 or 2100 for the next generation. But we need a short and mid-term vision with science-based policies, because decisions today will have implications in the future. So this short and mid-term perspective is important to tell us, how do we get there? How do we get the Paris Agreement targets? How do we get well below 2 degrees? Our modeling team has been highlighting this to local and central government policymakers, saying that strategic decisions and low carbon investments need to be made today. There's no time to be wasted if we want to achieve long-term climate goals and reduce climate risk. Our models tell us we can't, unfortunately, start to acting and having instruments that move towards 2 degrees target in the future, and then in the middle of the road decide to move to 1.5 target. Why? Because we have certain investments and energy lock-ins that won't be possible to shift in the future. For instance, in a 2 degrees world, biomass and second generation ethanol would be very relevant for duty vehicles and transportation. While if we think about, we would need to think about electrification, and available biomass would need to be used for decarbonizing the so-called hard sectors, for instance, aviation. So in this sense, we need to think strategically. We need to include social innovation today to see where we want to get in the future. And this is why science and policymaking interfaces are essential. Next slide, please. So just to summarize my key ideas, I'd like to thank my team. We have been working non-stop despite the troubling and challenging times, and we hope this, we have actually been talking about how to incorporate this black swan and crisis in our modeling. A famous poet used to say, the only traditional thing we have is inventing the future. So we modelers, we don't stop inventing the future, failing, and trying to be more accurate as much as possible. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'm here available for questions.
Thank you, Joana, and thank you very much for your perspective representing scientific community and pointing out the importance of the interface between scientific community and the policymaking community. Before I take questions, I would like to just ask panelists if you have any reflections on other panelists have spoken about. Maybe Giovani, you have some reflection on that?
I think it was a very interesting panel discussing different perspectives of the issue. I think my personal feelings are that we have a lot of agreement with all that was said. Even regarding to the last presentation of Professor Joana, I don't think that there is such a trade-off between short and long term. If you take all the variables in the short term, so of course there is a risk in standard assets and lock-in technologies for the useful life of a new project, but the same way as the innovation is an open field, there is a lot of things that might happen in the future that might change completely the perspective for the long term. So that's what I called avoid the technological lock-in, because if you choose a specific route, technological route, in a innovation process, you might be wrong, and you might discover this in the long term, and then it will be too late. So that's why we understand that it's very important to build flexible strategies and establish a very competitive marketplace. Because if you have a more competitive marketplace, then even the long-term issues will have to be present. Otherwise, we will destroy value in the long term. So I understand the trade-off that was pointed out, but I think it's possible to handle this trade-off if you take the short-term decisions, considering all the implication for the business in the long term. That's my.
Thank you, Giovani. Just let me follow up one question on what you said, that you talked about difficult issues of choosing the technology. If you choose the wrong technology, then you are stuck there. So what is the key like uncertainties or innovation that you see in your country facing, and what are the kind of major problems that you are facing as a energy planning office? Is there something that particular issues in terms of the selection of technologies that you are facing now?
Okay, as I said during my presentation, we have in Brazil a paradox of abundance. So we have all the alternatives in Brazil. So in this sense, all the specific investor believes that their technology is the key for the future. And that's why we need a competitive marketplace in such a way that different technological routes can compete. Let's go to a practical example. There is different technological routes in electrical vehicle. So if you choose one specific route and you are wrong, you are dead in the future. So just take, for instance, some years ago, not so long, people believe that DVD would be replaced by Blu-ray. And then there was a leapfrog, a technological leapfrog, and streaming took all the market, basically all the markets from Blu-ray in the future. So you have a leapfrog technological process. So that's a major risk for governments and policymakers to try to guess what will be the winner technology in the future. So that's why you should promote new technologies, innovations, but you have to put them to compete in the marketplace, because you don't have certainty about specific routes, and that's the point I want to raise.
Thank you, Giovani. Ruud, any reflection?
Two. One is on this mention of the long term versus the short time objectives associated with kind of and policy making. And Professor Joana mentioned two issues there: the social acceptedness, and also the institutional options which are available to policymakers to make choices. And I think both of those are indeed correct. If the models present us with, a cost-effective solution for 2050, assuming all of our assumptions are correct and our input parameters are correct, but at the end of the day, you need those policy objectives to get through a process in most countries. In the European Union, that means that all EU member states have to agree upon it, as well as the Parliament has to agree upon it. But I think it's not as simple as just being long-term objectives versus short-term objectives. And to give a specific example, as in many other countries, youth has taken the street in Brussels and across European capitals to ask for more stringent measures on climate change. And I think that has had a real effect on the policymakers in Europe, and that by creating these long-term objectives as a criteria for social acceptability, it still managed to find a way into the policy decision-making process. So I think that it's not a dichotomy which cannot be solved, but which requires, of course, that these long-term objectives are being brought back into the social discourse or the institutional options which are available to policymakers. Then one other question that's as a response to Giovani, and I absolutely agree, kind of also within in Europe, we're really looking at, okay, how can we make sure that our markets are dynamic, flexible and fluid, such that those choices are being made. Of course, if we move from the choices on what energy supply options do we have for Europe versus, okay, how are we going to get those options to the end consumers? Infrastructure is a key issue. And there we do have certain questions which long-term energy scenario can play a role, but which we need in order to avoid any risks. Should we invest in upgrading our electricity infrastructure in Europe in order to allow for the full electrification of heating for all buildings? Or should we focus much more on the development of local heating and district networks in cities? These are two options which will need an infrastructure, and that infrastructure will need to be there in order to have those options available to the end consumer. Same for example, the questions which we have versus electricity or hydrogen or power to gas options. These pathways are essentially pathways because they are different pathways because they rely on different infrastructures to get these decarbonized energy sources to end consumers. So there it is indeed critical to have those choices right, such that as the markets demand these choices to be available to the consumers, the infrastructure is available in order to have that being possible in a future energy system.
Thank you, Ruud. Joana, you have any reflection on that?
Yes, please. Thank you, Asima. Reflections and some comments from previous speakers. We are very much aligned, it seems to me. I didn't mean there's a trade-off between short and mid-term scenarios and long-term. I actually see a strong complementarity and strong synergies between one and another. I did mean we can't move along. It's like having two legs, left and right, and they both need to walk side by side in parallel, and able to have a sustainable and consistent climate transition in future. It seems to me in some governments tend to think too narrow vision and too short-term perspectives, missing the big picture. And our job as scientists, as influential modelers and researchers, is actually to open up visions of policymakers. And to do that is essential to identify innovation niches and economic opportunities. And I agree with Giovani and Ruud. It's challenging to identify the next technology, the next innovation. But in my view, being from the global south, as mentioned before by previous speakers, we have abundance of resources. So it seems to me we need to step up and not waiting for other countries to tell us what will be the next, but actually take the risk and challenge. And we have unique specificities here in the global south that can be a big advantage and opportunity for climate transition. Having said that, we have large social challenge, different economic pathways, inequality, weaker institutional and governance vision sometimes. So it seems to be a key aspect, both for scientists and policymakers, is to improve our communication strategies in order to have other stakeholders involved and key social and community partners, because this won't be possible if we don't have the right institutions, the good governance, and the social acceptance. So thank you.
Thank you, Joana. So in the interest of time, I would like to take just one question from the audience, which is about scenario, the methodologies. So when we talk about risks and innovations, do you still see a lot of gaps in addressing these issues? So what are the remaining gaps that government practitioners see in the process of development of scenarios? And if I might be able to add my personal question to this, is because we, as IRENA intergovernmental organization, works mainly with the government, but we also engage a lot of modelers, practitioners. So where do you see so what is the gap, and how can this research community can actually support in addressing these gaps? And maybe from Joana's point of view, if you answer how the scientific community can maybe help to bridge the gap. Maybe I can start with Giovani again.
Let me see if I understood the question correctly. The question is about how to consider innovations in the energy long-term planning. Is that right?
Innovation and also risks. So is there any, I know that we are not really there yet, our models are not really good enough to address all these questions, but where do you see the biggest gaps, and how can maybe research community can support this gap, to fill the gap?
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the National Energy Plan 2050 of Brazil. We have been simulating several different areas in the last couple of years, and because of our strategy was to define, used to be to define reference scenarios and alternative scenarios, and there is a lot of things happen, not only in the world, but particularly in Brazil in the last couple of years. All the assumptions degrade so fast that we needed to rework all the studies several times. So then what we decide to do this time, we decided to work much more with several simulations than to establish specific scenarios about the considering different assumptions, and that was a very interesting choice, because we have run like almost more than 80 scenarios. Simulations. and that brought to us a totally different figure of the process. Then we could simulate what happened with the energy matrix if there is a barrier because of social and environmental acceptability to use like remaining hydroelectric potential in the north of the country. What would happen if the cost of nuclear would go down, and with innovations in like smaller modular reactors. What would happen if energy storage did not will not become cheaper enough to provide reliability to the system with more non-dispatchable renewables like wind and solar? How you could connect everything and keep the reliability? So the broader view was very informative, with trying to mapping all the risks and uncertainties, and there is some consistency of the whole picture. So you cannot say like that particular source will have 10% or 20%, but you have like a range of the totals, the whole set of simulations. So you can see that it could be from 10 to 20, depending on the assumptions and so on. So it's a way to handle the risks and the uncertainties to see what kind of answer you can have in the market depending on changes on circumstance, on the conditions, regarding costs, regarding potentials, because regarding social and environmental acceptability, and all of them. So that's the way we are handling risks and uncertainties in the long term right now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giovani. Ruud, the same question to you.
Okay, let me try. I agree, and let me try to take it from a different angle. And that is, first of all, indeed, within the European Commission, we constantly have to update our kind of inputs in terms of, technology costs and performance of different energy technology options as innovation continues to improve them. But what we don't really still have a handle on is, I think, not as well innovation in the demand side. Let me give me a couple of examples. For example, someone mentioned, Professor Joana mentioned the hard to decarbonize sectors. And indeed, for example, the aviation sector or the heavy duty transport, we have been characterizing as hard to decarbonize sectors for still actually, but now new innovations are emerging even there in those sectors where we thought that we didn't think any energy innovations will be possible, including carbon switch already appearing on the market. Another area is, for example, the industry sector. Refinery, large chemical complexes have been, large energy users high temperature heat for hundreds of years. But even now here in Europe, we start to hear processes, activities where actually just start thinking about electric crackers, something which was set not to be possible not that long ago. Also, transport in itself, or manufacturing itself. How would 3D manufacturing change our energy demand landscape? Or transport, we have a lot of kind of light duty vehicles, for example, in cities, which are actually quite a big amount of the energy demand here in Europe. So how are drones, etc., delivering packages to our households, changing this energy demand for our future energy system? We don't have a very good hold on that yet. On risk, I think the many things which we cannot do yet, but I think and we see also some academic publications coming out on that, which I think is very encouraging, is to indeed look at the risk of non-action, especially in terms of the energy transition. So how can we incorporate the risks of non-actions, the impacts on of potential kind of environmental impacts on coastal issues, on social issues, on health, on just the financial system in terms of insurances, etc. How would we be able to incorporate those into our energy systems modeling? That's one of the key areas where I think more work could be done and is needed in order to help policymakers in setting the right policies.
Thank you, Ruud. So final word for Joana from the scientific community perspective.
Thank you, Asama. So I'd like to comment from a more scientific perspective. I would identify three major gaps we have in modeling community. Firstly, demand has already mentioned, and I would like to concretize with some specific examples. Our models are mainly quantitative, integrated assessment models that forecast with perfect conditions of economy, of information, of agents. And we do know different agents are far from being rational, and human behavior is very different from assuming a least cost option. Just to give an example, in many times we decide to use our private vehicle to go to work, even though it may be more expensive than taking the tube or the bus. There is a matter of status, is a matter of safety, is a matter of time. Another good example is about food consumption. We have been seeing it's extremely difficult to introduce behavior changes for dietary changes, and how to rethink our food habits and our consumption habits. In many cultures, eating meat is a matter of status, more than actually thinking about human health or climate conditions. Another very good example is about farmers. Many smallhold farmers tend to optimize to increase their resilience. So thinking in long-term resilience rather than having a higher productivity for the next season and harvest. So all these heterogeneities in agents are overlooked by our integrated assessment model. So it's very challenging to develop scenarios, and we keep adjusting and updating our assumptions. A second gap I would like to highlight is also related to risks and what is the cost of doing nothing. It's troublesome to see baseline or reference scenarios, usually meaning a least cost option compared with mitigation one. But actually, this happens because we are not internalizing the climate impact and the risks of doing nothing in long term. And we can't forget tropical areas such as in Brazil will have higher impact for climate change, extreme events that already happen here. A third and last gap I would like to highlight is actually about discrepancy. not only in terms of technologies, but what we call the black swans, what we are living now. We are in IPCC considering rethinking about our literature review assessment because the literature available out there, and I would like to clarify, in IPCC we do not develop original research. Authors rely on available research and scientists develop literature assessment. So if we don't have available research and scientific papers, we can't actually develop the assessment. So we are thinking about baselines and timeline years that are very much, these are just what we are having and the troubling times we are facing now. So how do we incorporate this disruption, not only in technology, but also in social challenge, is actually something that we need to rethink. Thank you.
Thank you, Joana. With this, I would like to thank all the three speakers. And let me just spend like 5 minutes to wrap up the whole forum, because this is the last session of the whole forum. So first of all, thank you very much, Giovani, Ruud, Joana. So yeah, so we had actually more than 700 people registered in the whole webinar, and on average we had constantly 300 people connected. And of course, we would have liked to organize this in a physical format, but at the same time, we were able to engage more people than we would have done it in the physical form. And of course, we also reduced the travel-related emissions. So we are very happy how it worked out. We are actually a bit worried about the situation because technology, we are not experienced with everyone. Almost every speaker speaks from home. So that was really unprecedented challenge, but I think we managed it very well. And in next day or two, all the participants will receive questionnaire to give us some feedback. So it was really for us the first time that we organized this kind of forum in this format. So we would also like to hear very much from everyone your experience. And also thank you very much for all the participants for sending us the questions, and we are very sorry that we could not take all the questions because of obviously the time was limited. But as we explained to you during the sessions, we are going to forward all the questions to the respective session speakers for the bilateral follow-up. So we'll see how we can take them forward in the coming days. And also we'll be sharing the materials once we have permission from all the speakers. So these are now the logistic comment, and we also want to talk a little bit about the content of the discussion. So we have amazing speakers, and we are very happy to see a lot of cross references across the sessions. So let me just go through what we have discussed today. So we had on session 1, we discussed about the view from the electric industry about their perspective for the electrification, and we saw like very much in agreement in all the speakers that electrification is going to be very important and renewable is going to be the key. And in the second session, session 2, we discussed about the different ranges of narratives and how these impacts different sectors in a different way. And in the session 3, stakeholder engagement, we had speakers talking about just and inclusive transition and how how this transition can be managed by better stakeholder engagement in the scenario development process. And then in the session 4, systemic innovation in energy demand. So already in this session, we also discussed about the innovation in the energy demand. We actually discussed some very good example of how some research organizations have already addressing these issues. And we also discussed importance of electrification and digitalization. But we also found out that there are still some like big uncertainty, and we need to better understand consumer behavior and business models. And last session, robust and resilient LTES development process, we discussed about importance of institutional processes for development of scenarios, including legal process and stakeholder engagement. And now we had very interesting session, the final session, to discuss about importance of, so we discussed that it's, we do acknowledge that there's the risk and challenges in representing systemic innovation, but it's important to keep the competitive market, and there's still a challenge to be addressed. So with this brief summary, I would like to mention also that at IRENA, we continue working on this line of work. We have this LTES campaign, which is the network of the government that belongs to the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is the 27 countries. And for all the other governments and also the institution directly supporting the national government, we have something called LTES network. So if anyone is interested in engaging us in this work, please send us email at ltes@irena.org. I would also like to announce that very soon, actually we are planning to do it in next month, but maybe we have to reschedule that. But we have been discussing with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and with IRENA, we are organizing like technical workshop focusing on comparison of scenarios. So we are going to announce that very soon once we have clarity on when we can start traveling. So I hope that everyone would be interested. And I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for those who joined the whole day. And I'm sorry for people who were not able to join because of the time difference. But I hope that we will be putting all these materials if the presenters agree. And I hope everyone to stay safe and stay well and keep in touch. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Asami. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.